consider God's great power. It's a subset of what I've just said. God is great, and in a storm you see his great power, whether it's the torrential rains, the whipping wind, or whether it's the strike of lightning that is absolutely unthinkably powerful. How does it work? Well, whatever Wikipedia says, that's how it all works. I don't know how it works. If you go to your kid's 6th grade science book to look this up, and be careful with 6th grade science books because they have pat answers for everything, you're going to have the explanation of how this works with electrical, electrons floating to the bottom of these big clouds and positive charges at the top and the positive charge on the ground and some negative charges on the ground. And you get the leader coming up and the strike coming down. And that's how it works. You'll get the explanation. Go a couple layers deeper, though, if you would. Do a little research on lightning. And you'll find out this is a very difficult and complex thing. People do not understand it. Today, there's competing theories about how this takes place. I mean, we know negative and positive charges. We understand at least the attraction of that. And it's like you rubbing your feet on the carpet and touching the doorknob at the right time of year with the right kind of ambient thing going on in your room, and you get that little shock. Well, that's a little tiny shock. It's certainly not a billion volts of electricity. And they're trying to figure out exactly how this works. Now, I'm not a God of the gaps guy. You understand that. I don't believe that God is just necessary for the things we can't explain in science. I don't believe that at all. I believe just what verse 10 says. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. He sits enthroned as king forever. He is the one who created the whole thing. He upholds everything by the word of his power. That's what I believe because that's what the Bible teaches. And that, I think, makes sense and is the only thing we can do with all the available evidence. I get that. But it is interesting that when it comes to something so simple, from Ben Franklin to Steve Jobs, we still can't figure this thing out with electricity, how this works. I mean, there are theories about cosmic rays and all the things that seed this and make this happen. There's a phenomenon, even with positively charged lightning strikes, that they can't figure out. Now, how does that work? Does it just come from the top of the cloud? How does this stuff get explained? Is it really just ice particles or dust particles and electrons being stripped as it comes down? I mean, there are theories. And some of these things don't work with all the test cases in here. Here's a cloud without any ice particles. Here's a cloud that seems too small to make this work on our equations. Here's something that doesn't make sense at all regarding the positive and negative charges of a cloud. We still don't understand it. And I'm just saying it's an interesting field of study. It is important for us to stand back and say, it is an amazing expression of God's power that we still can't in our modern age, as you carry computers around in your pocket, we don't know how this all works. God is complex. We don't fully comprehend it. And yet we do know this. God's glory is reflected even in the damaging disruptions of nature like thunderstorms, because without it, we got problems on this planet. Oh, we wouldn't have problems with the canopy, and we wouldn't have problems with this kind of this greenhouse effect. We wouldn't have problems pre-flood, but post-flood, we need thunderstorms, not just in the destruction of the earth that God uses to destroy it in Genesis 6 through 9, but what we see afterwards. We need a cleaning of the air through thunderstorms. We lose 20 degrees in temperature because of the existence of thunderstorms post-flood. I mean, this is an important part, not to mention the shade and everything else in these warm climates. This is something, by the way, that brings the #1 source of moisture to the middle of continents around the world. Thunderstorms. Without those, we got problems in the middle of these continents, which we wouldn't have problems before the flood. But the post-diluvian world needs this. Not to mention, did you know that nitrogen gas in a strike of electricity turns nitrogen gas into nitrogen particles, and those nitrogen particles then float to the earth like dust. And if you know anything about gardening, you certainly need nitrogen in the soil. I don't think you would need that the way we need it now in a post-flood world, but you got to have that. As a matter of fact, even in modern farming, where they're mass-producing food in their farms, modern farmers say 10% of the nitrogen that they need in their soils comes from lightning strikes. It's an amazing reality. All this coming from God. In the interesting work of the world, whether it's bacteria, whether it's the food chain, whether it's even sicknesses that we have to deal with for certain reasons, whether it's weather patterns, all of these things now have a role to play in a post-fall, post-diluvian world. The triune God is powerful and also gracious. Even in the things he does, and at the end of these thunderstorms, sometimes if the sun is out just right, we see that splitting of the spectral wave of light. We see the rainbow, and though we deserve a catastrophic world-destroying flood every 50 years or so, God said, I'm going to hold all the judgment to the end when it comes to catastrophic worldwide events. I'm going to save it for judgment at the end. And God has promised to never destroy the earth the way he did in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. God is gracious even in the expressions of his judgment, which is certainly reflected in thunderstorms. With all that, and I hope we stand, and can't do it in 50 minutes, but I hope we stand in awe of what God expresses even in something so simple as a thunderstorm. That reminds us of the summary statement here in verse number 10 that the Lord, Yahweh, sits enthroned above the flood. He's over the flood. He's over it all. He sits above the storm. And Yahweh sits enthroned as king forever. He's sovereign. He's in charge. He's bigger than his creation. He's more powerful than his creation. And then this interesting, tender prayer of David, may Yahweh give strength to his people. May Yahweh bless his people with peace. You need, just like with your kids, putting them to bed in a thunderstorm, strength and peace in a chaotic world of abrupt and violent weather. We need that. And in this passage we see being humbled by a storm. God, we graciously ask you for these things. Number 3 on your outline, we ought to humbly seek God's gracious gifts